the New Year's Day pancake breakfast mystery. Welcome to Velvet Clues, your sanctuary for timeless mysteries and elegant intrigue. I'm Connor, and I'll be your guide this evening through a tale that proves even the most wholesome traditions can harbour the darkest secrets. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. What's your favourite small-town tradition? Perhaps it's a summer fair, a holiday parade, or maybe a community breakfast. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I always enjoy hearing how these gatherings bring communities together, though, as we'll discover tonight, sometimes they reveal far more than anyone expects. Now, settle in with your favourite beverage, and let me tell you about Miss Jane Marple and the tragedy that befell St. Mary Mead on what should have been the most joyous morning of the year. Chapter 1. Griddles and Goodwill on New Year's morning. The first day of January had dawned clear and cold over St. Mary Mead, with that peculiar quality of light that seems to promise fresh beginnings and the possibility of redemption from whatever small failures the previous year might have contained. Miss Jane Marple, making her careful way along the high street toward the village hall, observed with mild approval how the frost had transformed the ordinary landscape into something rather magical, each blade of grass edged with silver, and every spider's web turned to delicate lace. The annual Lions Club pancake breakfast had been a fixture of St. Mary Mead's calendar for more than 20 years, and Miss Marple had attended every single one since its inception. It was the sort of event that brought together all strata of village society, from Colonel Melchett and his wife to the postman's family, united in their appreciation of hot pancakes, strong tea, and the worthy causes that the Lions Club supported with such dedication. This year's breakfast held particular significance, as the club had recently launched an ambitious campaign to provide seeing-eye dogs for blind residents of the surrounding counties. Miss Marple had been most impressed by the commitment shown by the club members, particularly their president, Harold Finchley, who had spoken so movingly at last month's parish council meeting about the transformative power of such assistance. As she approached the village hall, Miss Marple could already smell the enticing aroma of cooking pancakes drifting through the crisp morning air. The hall's double doors stood open despite the cold, and through them she could see the familiar bustle of volunteers preparing for what promised to be their largest turnout yet. Someone had strung paper decorations across the ceiling, cheerful colours that spoke of celebration and community spirit. Mrs. Dolly Bantry was already inside, wearing a festive apron emblazoned with cartoon pancakes and wielding a spatula, with the confidence of someone who had been flipping pancakes since childhood. She waved enthusiastically as Miss Marple entered, nearly upending a plate of butter pats in her enthusiasm. "Jane, my dear," she called out above the general hubbub, "do come and help us with the batter. We've made an absolutely enormous quantity this year, and I'm terrified we'll run short despite our best efforts." Miss Marple made her way through the crowded hall, noting with interest the various preparations underway. Long tables had been set up in rows, each covered with cheerful checkered cloths, and set with simple but adequate cutlery. At the far end of the hall, an impressive array of griddles had been arranged on folding tables, attended by volunteers in matching aprons, who worked with the practiced efficiency of a well-organised military operation. The batter station occupied a central position near the kitchen door, where 3 large mixing bowls sat in a row, each filled to capacity with pale golden liquid. Miss Marple observed that someone had taken great care to ensure consistency, as all 3 bowls appeared to contain exactly the same mixture, stirred to identical smoothness and marked with small labels reading Bowl 1, Bowl 2, and Bowl 3 in neat black lettering. Harold Finchley stood near the batter station, clipboard in hand, overseeing the preparations with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him such an effective club president. He was a man of perhaps 55 years, with the hearty build and ruddy complexion of someone who enjoyed good food and convivial company. His booming laugh could be heard frequently throughout the morning as he greeted arriving volunteers and thanked them for their contributions to the breakfast. "Miss Marple," Mr. Finchley exclaimed, catching sight of her as she approached the batter station. "Wonderful to see you as always. I trust you'll be having your usual stack this morning. 3 pancakes lightly buttered with just a touch of syrup." Miss Marple smiled at this display of memory. "You're quite right, Mr. Finchley, though I confess I'm always amazed at how you manage to remember everyone's preferences." "Part of the job," he replied, with evident satisfaction. "A good president knows his constituency, whether it's Lions Club members or Pancake breakfast patrons." As they spoke, Miss Marple noticed a young woman standing somewhat apart from the main activity, watching the preparations with an expression that seemed to combine longing with something darker. She was perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair pulled back severely and dressed in clothes that, while neat, showed signs of careful mending and economy. What caught Miss Marple's particular attention, however, was the white cane the young woman held, and the way her unseeing eyes tracked the sounds around her with practiced precision. "That's Sarah Whitmore," Mrs. Bantry whispered, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Thomas Whitmore's daughter from over at Fernley Farm. Blind since birth, poor dear. Her father's been trying for months to get her approved for a seeing eye. Dog through the Lions Club program. But somehow the funding never seems to materialize." Miss Marple filed this information away with the careful attention she habitually applied to any detail that seemed to deviate from the expected pattern of village life. The Lions Club's Seeing Eye Dog program had been established specifically to help people like Sarah Whitmore, and it seemed peculiar that funding difficulties would prevent such an obvious candidate from receiving assistance. Her observation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who came bustling in with his medical bag, looking somewhat harassed. Despite the festive occasion, the doctor maintained his professional readiness, a habit that Miss Marple had always admired. "Morning all," Dr. Haydock announced cheerfully. "I've brought the first aid supplies, though I trust we won't need them. Can't recall we've ever had an emergency at the Pancake breakfast, but better safe than sorry." Mr. Finchley clapped the doctor on the shoulder with evident bonhomie. "Excellent, excellent. Though I must say the only emergency I anticipate is running out of maple syrup. We've got bottles and bottles of the stuff, all donated by the Sanderson farm." The mention of maple syrup drew Miss Marple's attention to another station, where bottles of the amber liquid stood in neat rows, each one labelled with the Sanderson farm's distinctive logo. Someone had also set out several pitchers for easier service, and volunteers were carefully decanting the syrup from bottles into these more practical containers. It was then that Miss Marple noticed Thomas Whitmore, Sarah's father, working at the syrup station with particular concentration. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with the weathered features and strong hands of someone who had spent his life in agricultural labour. His expression as he worked held a curious intensity that seemed somehow at odds with the festive atmosphere surrounding him. The hall was filling rapidly now as villagers began arriving for the breakfast. The first sitting was scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock sharp, and Mr. Finchley had been most emphatic that punctuality was essential to ensuring everyone received hot, fresh pancakes. Miss Marple observed the efficient system that had been established, with volunteers taking orders, delivering plates and clearing tables with practiced coordination. Mrs. Price Ridley swept in with her usual air of self-importance, accompanied by her husband, and demanding immediate seating, despite having arrived 15 minutes early. Mr. Finchley handled this minor crisis with diplomatic skill, ensuring the difficult woman was settled at a prime table with a pot of tea while she waited for the official start time. The vicar arrived shortly thereafter, bringing with him a group of parishioners who had attended early morning service. They filled 2 tables near the window, their conversation animated with discussion of the morning's sermon and their anticipation of the meal to come. As 8 o'clock approached, Mr. Finchley took his position at the front of the hall, tapping his clipboard with a spoon to gain attention. The general hubbub gradually subsided as people turned their attention to the club president. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and neighbours," he began in his characteristic booming voice, "welcome to the 22nd Annual Lions Club New Year's Day Pancake Breakfast. Before we begin serving, I'd like to thank all our volunteers who've worked so hard to make this event possible." He proceeded to recognise various contributors by name, drawing appreciative applause for the Sanderson Farms syrup donation, for Mrs. Bantry's coordination of the kitchen volunteers, for Dr. Haydock's medical readiness, and for numerous others who had contributed time, money or resources to the breakfast. And of course, Mr. Finchley continued, warming to his theme, All proceeds from this morning's event will go toward our Seeing Eye dog program, helping to provide independence and mobility to those in our community who most need our support. Miss Marple noticed how Sarah Whitmore's expression tightened at this announcement, and how her father's hands clenched briefly before he resumed his work at the syrup station. There was a story there, she thought, one that perhaps explained the tension she had sensed earlier. Now then, Mr. Finchley concluded with evident satisfaction, let's begin. Volunteers, to your stations. Everyone else prepare for the finest pancakes in all of England. The hall erupted into cheerful activity as the breakfast officially commenced. Volunteers moved with practiced efficiency, taking orders and delivering plates with remarkable speed. The griddles sizzled continuously as pancake after pancake was produced, each one golden and perfect, ready to be dressed with butter and the generous quantities of maple syrup that Mr. Finchley had promised. Miss Marple accepted her own plate with thanks, noting that the pancakes were indeed excellent, light, fluffy, and cooked to precisely the right degree of brownness. She applied a modest amount of butter and syrup, then settled in to enjoy her breakfast, while observing the cheerful chaos around her. It was perhaps 20 minutes into the meal when she noticed Mr. Finchley helping himself to a particularly large stack of pancakes. He had been working tirelessly to ensure everything ran smoothly, and he clearly felt entitled to reward himself with a generous portion. Miss Marple watched as he doused his stack liberally with syrup from one of the pitchers, then cut into the fluffy golden rounds with evident anticipation. The first bite brought a smile of satisfaction to his face. The second prompted a nod of approval, but as he prepared to take a third bite, his expression changed abruptly. The fork paused halfway to his mouth, trembling slightly, and his ruddy complexion began to pale in a manner that Miss Marple found distinctly alarming. Mr. Finchley set down his fork with exaggerated care, as though the simple movement required enormous concentration. His breathing had become laboured, and a fine sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead, despite the coolness of the morning. "Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple called out sharply, her voice cutting through the general conversation. "Dr. Haydock, I believe Mr. Finchley requires your immediate attention." The doctor's head snapped up from his own breakfast, his professional instincts immediately alert. He was at Mr. Finchley's side within seconds, his experienced hands checking pulse and pupils with practiced efficiency. "Harold, what's wrong?" Dr. Haydock demanded. "Can you speak? Tell me what you're feeling." Mr. Finchley's lips moved, but no sound emerged. His face had gone from pale to an alarming greyish colour, and his breathing had become increasingly desperate. The convivial atmosphere of the breakfast dissolved instantly as nearby diners realised something was seriously amiss. "Someone call an ambulance," Dr. Haydock ordered sharply. "Now! And clear these tables. Give us room." But even as willing hands moved to comply, it was evident that no ambulance would arrive in time. Harold Finchley's body convulsed once, violently, then went completely still. The breakfast plate before him remained nearly full, the stack of golden pancakes swimming in their pool of maple syrup, an obscene contrast to the tragedy that had just unfolded. Dr. Haydock worked frantically to revive the club president, but after several long minutes he sat back with an expression of profound frustration and grief. He looked up at the circle of horrified faces surrounding him and shook his head slowly. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly. "Harold's gone." The cheerful hall, full of celebrating villagers, had become, in the space of a few terrible minutes, the scene of an unexplained death, and Miss Marple, observing the shock and confusion around her, found herself noting several details that troubled her considerably. The partially eaten pancakes on Mr. Finchley's plate, the specific pitcher of syrup he had used, and most significantly the expression on Thomas Whitmore's face as he stood frozen at the syrup station, a look that combined horror with something that might almost have been grim satisfaction. Chapter 2. Sweet Suspicion and a Missing Bottle. The transformation of the village hall from a scene of celebration to one of tragedy had occurred with shocking suddenness, leaving the assembled villagers in a state of stunned disbelief. Dr. Haydock had immediately taken charge, directing volunteers to evacuate the hall while he remained with Mr. Finchley's body. But the orderly departure had been complicated by the natural human impulse to remain and try to make sense of what had just occurred. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the entrance, where she could observe both the general exodus and the specific reactions of those individuals whose behaviour might prove significant. Mrs. Bantry had joined her there, her festive apron now seeming somehow inappropriate given the circumstances. "I simply cannot believe it," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her voice shaking. "Harold was perfectly healthy. Why, I saw him just yesterday at the post office planning today's breakfast, with his usual energy." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her keen eyes still scanning the dispersing crowd. Indeed, he appeared to be in excellent health, which makes his sudden collapse all the more puzzling. Dr. Haydock had covered Mr. Finchley's body with a tablecloth and was now examining the deceased man's breakfast plate with obvious concern. He picked up the fork that Mr. Finchley had been using, sniffed it carefully, then turned his attention to the remaining pancakes and their generous coating of syrup. "Jane," the doctor called out, noticing Miss Marple's proximity. "Might I have a word?" Miss Marple made her way through the thinning crowd to where Dr. Haydock waited, noting how the doctor's usual cheerful demeanour had been replaced by an expression of deep unease. "I don't like this at all," Dr. Haydock said quietly, gesturing toward the breakfast plate. "Harold's symptoms, the rapidity of onset, the way he went. It all suggests poisoning." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of that peculiar combination of intellectual curiosity and sadness that always accompanied her encounters with the darker aspects of human nature. "What sort of poison," she inquired gently, "might produce such symptoms?" Dr. Haydock glanced around to ensure they would not be overheard before responding. The sweet smell, the rapid onset, the particular colour of his complexion. "If I had to hazard a guess, I'd say ethylene glycol. Antifreeze." Miss Marple absorbed this information with characteristic calm, though her mind was already beginning to sort through the implications. Antifreeze would have a sweet taste, she observed. It might be masked by the maple syrup. "Precisely," Dr. Haydock agreed grimly, "which is why I'm particularly concerned about that pitcher of syrup." He indicated the container that Mr. Finchley had used, still sitting on the table where the club president had left it. Before Miss Marple could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps announced the arrival of Inspector Slack, who had evidently been summoned from his New Year's Day leisure by news of the tragedy. The inspector's expression suggested he was none too pleased about this disruption to his holiday. "Dr. Haydock," the inspector announced without preamble, "I understand we have a death under suspicious circumstances." The doctor provided a concise summary of events, including his suspicion regarding the cause of death. Inspector Slack's expression grew progressively grimmer as he listened, and by the time Dr. Haydock finished, the inspector had already begun issuing orders. "Right then," he said briskly. "Nobody leaves until I've taken statements. Dr. Haydock, I'll need that breakfast plate secured as evidence and that syrup pitcher as well, and someone find out who was responsible for the syrup station this morning." Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "I believe that would be Thomas Whitmore, Inspector, from Fernley Farm. He was working at the syrup station when I arrived this morning." Inspector Slack's head swiveled toward her. Was he indeed? "And where is Mr. Whitmore now?" That question proved more difficult to answer than anyone anticipated. A systematic search of the village hall and its immediate surroundings revealed no sign of Thomas Whitmore. According to several witnesses, he had been present when Mr. Finchley collapsed, but no one could recall seeing him during the evacuation. It was as though he had simply vanished into the confusion. "Most irregular," Inspector Slack muttered, making notes in his official notebook. "Most irregular indeed." "Miss Marple, since you seem to have observed Mr. Whitmore's activities, perhaps you can tell me more about his behaviour this morning." Miss Marple chose her words carefully, aware that speculation could be dangerous, but that withholding observations might be equally problematic. "Mr. Whitmore appeared to be performing his duties conscientiously," she said. "However, I did notice a certain intensity in his manner. He seemed perhaps more focused on his task than the festive occasion might warrant." Mrs. Bantry had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. "But surely Thomas Whitmore wouldn't harm anyone. He's lived in St. Mary Mead for decades. Everyone knows him as a decent, hard-working man." Inspector Slack's expression suggested he placed little faith in such character references when suspicious circumstances were involved. "We'll see about that." he said curtly. "For now, I want to know exactly what Mr. Whitmore had access to this morning, and I want to account for every container of maple syrup that was brought into this hall." The subsequent investigation of the syrup supply revealed several troubling discrepancies. According to the inventory that Mr. Finchley had maintained with his characteristic precision, the Lions Club had received a donation of 24 bottles of maple syrup from the Sanderson farm. 23 of these bottles could be accounted for, either still sealed in their original containers or decanted into pitchers for service. The 24th bottle was missing. Moreover, examination of the pitchers revealed that one of them, the very pitcher that Mr. Finchley had used to douse his fatal breakfast, had been filled from an unlabelled container rather than from any of the Sanderson farm bottles. The syrup in this pitcher appeared identical to the genuine product, but its provenance could not be established. Inspector Slack's expression grew increasingly grim as these facts emerged. "So, we have a missing bottle of legitimate syrup, and a pitcher of syrup that came from an unknown source, and the man who was in charge of the syrup station has conveniently disappeared. It does appear rather incriminating," Miss Marple agreed, "though I wonder whether we might consider the question of motive. Mr. Finchley was well liked in the village, was he not? Who might have wished him harm?" Mrs. Bantry shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to speak ill of anyone, but recognizing the necessity. "There have been some concerns," she said hesitantly, "about the Lions Club finances. Nothing definite, you understand, but some people have wondered why the Seeing Eye Dog program has been so slow to materialize despite the generous donations received." This revelation clearly interested Inspector Slack. "Financial irregularities," he mused. "That's a motive that bears investigation. Who raised these concerns?" "Thomas Whitmore," Mrs. Bantry replied quietly. "He's been trying for months to get his daughter Sarah approved for a service dog. The club kept saying there were insufficient funds, which seemed peculiar given the amounts that had supposedly been raised." Miss Marple filed this information away alongside her other observations. The pattern was beginning to emerge, though several crucial elements still required clarification. A man suspected of embezzlement, dead from poisoning. A father desperate to help his blind daughter, missing from the scene. And a bottle of maple syrup whose contents had been substituted with something far more sinister. "Inspector," she said carefully, "might I suggest that we examine Mr. Finchley's records regarding the Seeing Eye Dog program? If there were indeed financial irregularities, they might provide crucial context for understanding this morning's tragedy." Inspector Slack nodded grudgingly. "A sound suggestion, Miss Marple. I'll obtain a warrant to examine the club's financial records. In the meantime, I want this hall treated as a crime scene, and I want Thomas Whitmore found and brought in for questioning." As the inspector began organising a systematic search for the missing farmer, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the table where Mr. Finchley had taken his final meal. The breakfast plate remained where Dr. Haydock had left it, the partially eaten pancakes now cold and congealing in their pool of contaminated syrup. Something about the scene troubled her, though she could not immediately identify what had caught her attention. The pancakes themselves appeared perfectly normal, as did the plate and cutlery. Yet there was something, some detail that did not quite fit the expected pattern. Mrs. Bantry joined her at the table, following Miss Marple's contemplative gaze. "What are you thinking, Jane?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, studying the breakfast remains more closely. "I'm thinking about timing, Dolly." Mr. Finchley ate 2 bites of his pancakes before symptoms appeared. If the poison was in the syrup, as Dr. Haydock suspects, why did it not act more quickly? Perhaps he didn't get a sufficient dose with the first bite, Mrs. Bantry suggested. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. Or perhaps the syrup itself was not uniformly contaminated. She leaned closer, examining the pattern of syrup on the plate. "Observe how the syrup has pooled more deeply on one side of the plate. The first bite came from the less saturated area, while the second bite, the one that preceded his collapse, came from where the concentration was heaviest." Mrs. Bantry looked impressed despite the grim circumstances. "So, whoever poisoned the syrup knew that the victim would likely take multiple bites before receiving a fatal dose. Or," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "they intended to ensure that the poison would not be immediately detected. A delayed reaction might allow the contaminated syrup to be used by multiple victims before anyone realized what was happening." This chilling observation brought both women to silence for a moment. The implications were disturbing. If the poisoner had intended widespread harm rather than targeting Mr. Finchley specifically, then they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than a simple vengeful individual. The investigation continued throughout the morning as Inspector Slack's constables took statements from volunteers and attendees, catalogued evidence, and maintained security around the village hall. The festive decorations that had seemed so cheerful mere hours earlier now appeared almost mocking, a reminder of how quickly celebration could turn to tragedy. It was nearly noon when word came that Thomas Whitmore had been located at his farm, where he had apparently retreated immediately after Mr. Finchley's collapse. According to the constable who brought the news, Whitmore had offered no resistance to being brought in for questioning, but neither had he provided any explanation for his departure from the village hall. Miss Marple watched from the hall's entrance as Thomas Whitmore was escorted past. Noting the farmer's expression of weary resignation, he walked with the heavy tread of someone who knew that difficult times lay ahead, his weathered features set in lines of grim acceptance. As he passed, their eyes met briefly, and Miss Marple saw in his face something that troubled her considerably. It was not the expression of a guilty man trying to conceal his crimes, but rather the look of someone caught between competing loyalties, torn between protecting what he loved and doing what was right. The truth, Miss Marple reflected, as Whitmore disappeared into Inspector Slack's commandeered office, was rarely simple, and this particular truth, she suspected, would prove more complex and heartbreaking than anyone yet realized. Chapter 3. A Daughter's Devotion and an Empty Garage. The interview room that Inspector Slack had appropriated in the village hall was a small space normally used for storage, containing nothing more elaborate than a folding table and several uncomfortable chairs. Yet the austere surroundings seemed entirely appropriate for the grim business at hand, as Thomas Whitmore sat across from the inspector, his calloused hands folded on the table before him with careful precision. Miss Marple had been invited to observe the questioning, a concession that Inspector Slack had made with obvious reluctance, but which he recognized might prove valuable given her intimate knowledge of village affairs and her peculiar talent for drawing connections that others missed. "Mr. Whitmore," the inspector began without preamble, "I need you to account for your movements this morning, particularly your activities at the syrup station and your whereabouts during and after Mr. Finchley's collapse." Thomas Whitmore met the inspector's gaze steadily, his weather-beaten face betraying little emotion. "I arrived at the hall around 7 o'clock this morning," he said, in a voice that carried the measured cadence of someone choosing his words carefully. "I was assigned to the syrup station, decanting bottles into pitchers for easier service. And did you decant all the bottles provided by the Sanderson farm?" Inspector Slack pressed. Whitmore hesitated for just a fraction of a second before responding. "I decanted the bottles I was given. I didn't count them specifically." This evasion did not escape Inspector Slack's notice. "We're missing one bottle, Mr. Whitmore. 24 were donated, 23 can be accounted for." "Where's the 24th? "I wouldn't know," Whitmore replied, but his eyes had shifted away from the inspector's face, a telltale sign that Miss Marple recognized as significant. She interjected gently, "Mr. Whitmore, might I ask about your daughter Sarah? I understand she was present at the breakfast this morning." The mention of his daughter brought an immediate change to Whitmore's demeanor. His defensive posture softened slightly, and pain flickered across his features. "Sarah's blind, as you may know. She came because she wanted to support the Lions Club, despite everything." "Despite what, precisely?" Miss Marple inquired. "Despite being told repeatedly that there wasn't enough money to provide her with a service dog," Whitmore said, his voice hardening. "Despite months of promises and delays while that man—" He paused, visibly collecting himself. "While Mr. Finchley claimed the program lacked funds." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "So you had reason to believe Mr. Finchley was lying about the program's finances?" "I had reason to believe someone wasn't being honest," Whitmore corrected. Whether it was Mr. Finchley specifically or someone else in the organization, I couldn't say for certain. "But you suspected him," Inspector Slack pressed. Whitmore's silence was answer enough. After a moment, he continued with evident reluctance. "Sarah's been blind since birth. She's a bright girl, capable of so much, but she needs help to be truly independent. A service dog would change her life completely. When the Lions Club announced their program, we thought our prayers had been answered. And then, Miss Marple prompted gently. And then nothing happened, Whitmore said, his frustration evident despite his controlled tone. Applications were accepted, evaluations were conducted, donors contributed generously. But when it came time to actually provide dogs to approved recipients, suddenly there were funding issues, expenses that hadn't been anticipated, bureaucratic complications, always something preventing the actual assistance from materializing. Inspector Slack made notes in his official notebook. Did you confront Mr. Finchley about these delays? I tried to, several times. He was always very sympathetic, very apologetic, but nothing ever changed. Finally, about a month ago, I started asking questions about the specific finances. How much had been donated, where it was being held, what exactly was preventing distribution. And what did you discover? Miss Marple asked. Whitmore glanced at her, his expression suggesting he was weighing how much to reveal. I discovered that the amounts donated far exceeded what would be needed to provide service dogs for every approved applicant, with substantial funds left over. Yet Mr. Finchley kept insisting there wasn't enough money. Inspector Slack's eyes had sharpened with interest. You're suggesting he was embezzling from the program. I'm suggesting the numbers didn't add up, Whitmore replied carefully. What that means, I couldn't say definitively. The inspector shifted tactics abruptly. Where did you go after Mr. Finchley collapsed? Home, Whitmore said simply. I needed to check on something. In the middle of an emergency, Inspector Slack's skepticism was palpable. That strikes me as remarkably callous, Mr. Whitmore. A man had just died, and you simply walked away. I didn't know he was dead when I left, Whitmore protested. I thought perhaps he was having some sort of attack, that Dr. Haydock would be able to help him. And I needed. He paused, then continued with obvious reluctance. I needed to ensure my garage was secure. Your garage, Inspector Slack repeated. And why would your garage require securing at such a moment? Whitmore's jaw tightened, and he did not respond. Miss Marple observed this evasion with considerable interest, noting the protective instinct that seemed to underlie the farmer's refusal to elaborate. Mr. Whitmore, she said gently, I wonder whether you keep antifreeze in your garage. For your farm vehicles, perhaps? The farmer's face paled slightly, and Miss Marple knew her speculation had struck home. Most farmers do, he said finally. It's common enough. Inspector Slack was already rising from his chair. I'll need to examine your garage, Mr. Whitmore. If you refuse to consent, I'll obtain a warrant, but it will go easier for you if you cooperate voluntarily. Whitmore sat in silence for a long moment, clearly wrestling with some internal conflict. Finally, he nodded slowly. You can examine the garage, but I want to be present when you do. The journey to Fernley Farm was accomplished in Inspector Slack's official vehicle, with Miss Marple accompanying them at the inspector's grudging invitation. The farm lay perhaps 2 miles beyond the village proper, a modest operation that showed signs of careful maintenance despite obvious financial constraints. Sarah Whitmore was waiting on the front porch as they arrived, her white cane held before her and her unseeing eyes tracking the sound of the approaching vehicle with practiced precision. Miss Marple observed how the young woman's posture stiffened as she recognized her father's voice among those emerging from the car. "Father," Sarah called out, her voice carrying a note of anxiety. "Is everything all right?" "It's fine, Sarah," Whitmore replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "These people just need to look at the garage. You go inside and wait for me." But Sarah made no move to comply. Instead, she descended the porch steps with careful precision, her cane tapping a path toward the garage building that stood some 20 yards from the main house. "I want to be there too," she said firmly. The garage proved to be a simple wooden structure containing an aging farm truck and various implements and supplies arranged with a methodical organization typical of someone who depended on being able to find things efficiently. Inspector Slack began his examination immediately, focusing his attention on a shelf near the back where various automotive fluids were stored in clearly labelled containers. Whitmore stepped forward. "My antifreeze is right there, the green container on the second shelf. I keep it properly labelled and stored, as you can see." Inspector Slack lifted the container, noting its substantial weight. When did you last use this? Whitmore considered the question. Late November, I believe. Preparing the truck for winter temperatures. The inspector unscrewed the cap and examined the contents. This appears to be full, or nearly so. How much antifreeze do you typically keep on hand? Just that one container, Whitmore replied. It's sufficient for my needs. Miss Marple had been observing Sarah during this exchange, noting how the young woman's hands gripped her cane with white-knuckled intensity, and how her face had grown progressively paler as the examination continued. There was something in her expression that spoke of terrible knowledge, the burden of understanding something she wished desperately she did not know. Sarah, Miss Marple said gently, moving to stand beside the young woman. Perhaps you should return to the house. This must be very distressing for you. Sarah's head turned toward her, those unseeing eyes somehow conveying depths of emotion that seeing eyes might have concealed. You don't understand, she whispered. None of this is his fault. He was only trying to help me. Inspector Slack's head snapped around at these words. Miss Whitmore, are you saying your father had something to do with Mr. Finchley's death? No, Sarah said quickly, but the denial lacked conviction. That is, I don't know. I only know that he's been so worried, so angry about the program. And he told me last week that he was going to make sure I got the help I needed, no matter what it took. Thomas Whitmore had gone very still, his face reflecting a mixture of anguish and resignation. Sarah, you shouldn't say anything more, please. But Sarah continued, her words tumbling out with a desperate need to unburden herself. He kept saying that people who stole from the blind deserved whatever happened to them, that Mr. Finchley had betrayed everyone who trusted him. And then, this morning, before we left for the breakfast, I heard him in the garage. She paused, tears beginning to stream down her face. He was doing something with containers. I could hear liquid pouring. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Inspector Slack exchanged a significant glance with his constable, while Miss Marple observed the tableau of father and daughter with a mixture of compassion and concern. Mr. Whitmore, the inspector said formally, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you poison Harold Finchley? Whitmore's response was not what anyone expected. Instead of protesting his innocence, he looked at his daughter with an expression of such profound love and sorrow that Miss Marple felt her heart contract. Then he turned to face Inspector Slack and said quietly, I want to speak with a solicitor before answering any further questions. The implications of this refusal were clear to everyone present. Inspector Slack produced his handcuffs for the second time that morning. Thomas Whitmore, I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Sarah Whitmore collapsed to her knees, her cane falling from nerveless fingers as sobs racked her frame. Miss Marple moved immediately to comfort her, helping the young woman to her feet and guiding her toward the house while Whitmore was escorted to the police vehicle. Miss Marple, Sarah whispered desperately, please, you have to understand, my father would never hurt anyone. He's the kindest, most gentle man. If something terrible has happened, it's my fault. All of this is because of me. Miss Marple helped Sarah into the house and settled her into a chair, noting how the young woman's entire body trembled with the force of her distress. She found a blanket and wrapped it around Sarah's shoulders, then prepared a cup of strong, sweet tea using the kettle that stood ready on the stove. Now then, she said gently, sitting beside Sarah and pressing the warm cup into her hands, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever has happened, blaming yourself will not help your father or anyone else. What might help is the truth. Sarah raised her tear-stained face toward Miss Marple's voice. But I don't know the truth. I only know what I heard and what my father said and how angry he's been. And now, Mr. Finchley is dead, and everyone will think my father killed him because of me. Miss Marple patted Sarah's hand with gentle reassurance. The police will investigate thoroughly. If your father is innocent, the truth will emerge. But what if he isn't innocent? Sarah whispered. What if he did this terrible thing because I need a service dog so badly, and he couldn't bear to see me suffer. That, Miss Marple reflected silently, was indeed the question that lay at the heart of this tragedy. How far might a father's love drive him? And if love had indeed led to murder, how could justice be served without destroying the very person that love had sought to protect? Chapter 4. Ledgers and Lies in the Club President's Den. The investigation into Harold Finchley's financial affairs began that same afternoon, with Inspector Slack obtaining a warrant to examine both the Lions Club records and Mr. Finchley's personal papers. Miss Marple had accompanied the inspector to the deceased man's residence, a comfortable Tudor-style house on the better side of the village, where Mrs. Finchley received them with the numb courtesy of someone still struggling to comprehend her suddenly altered circumstances. Mrs. Finchley was a pleasant woman of perhaps 50 years, with soft features and the slightly bewildered air of someone accustomed to letting others make decisions. She showed them into her late husband's study, a well-appointed room lined with books and dominated by a large oak desk that bore signs of recent use. Harold was working on the club accounts just yesterday, Mrs. Finchley said, her voice breaking slightly. He was always so meticulous about the records, said it was important to maintain absolute transparency when handling charitable funds. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Inspector Slack, both recognizing the bitter irony of this statement, if their suspicions about embezzlement proved correct. The inspector began his examination of the desk's contents while Miss Marple, with Mrs. Finchley's permission, explored the bookcases that lined the walls. The Lions Club financial records were contained in 3 large ledgers, each one meticulously maintained with entries in Mr. Finchley's characteristic neat handwriting. Inspector Slack spread them across the desk, comparing entries and tracing the flow of funds with the practiced eye of someone experienced in detecting financial irregularities. "Miss Marple," he said, after perhaps 20 minutes of examination, "I think you should see this." She moved to stand beside him, observing where his finger indicated a series of entries related to the Seeing Eye Dog program. The income side of the ledger showed substantial donations, exactly as Thomas Whitmore had suggested. Various individuals and businesses had contributed generously, their gifts carefully recorded with dates, amounts and purposes clearly specified. The expenditure side, however, told a different story. While there were numerous entries for administrative costs, travel expenses and program development, actual disbursements for service dogs were conspicuously absent. Instead, there appeared to be a pattern of transfers to something labelled General Operating Fund, with a frequency and amounts that struck Miss Marple as highly suspicious. "These transfers," Inspector Slack observed grimly, "they're all made by Mr. Finchley, approved by Mr. Finchley, and recorded by Mr. Finchley. No secondary authorization, no oversight, no independent verification." Mrs. Finchley had drawn closer, peering over their shoulders at the ledgers. "I don't understand," she said uncertainly. "Harold always said the other board members reviewed everything carefully." Inspector Slack flipped to the back of the ledger where authorization signatures should have been recorded. The pages were blank. "It appears," he said carefully, "that your husband may have been less than entirely honest about the review process." Miss Marple had moved to examine Mr. Finchley's personal bank statements, which lay in a folder marked Household Finances. The recent deposits struck her as remarkably generous for someone whose primary income came from managing a small investment firm. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we should examine Mr. Finchley's personal accounts more closely. These deposits correspond rather suspiciously with the transfers from the Lions Club General Operating Fund." The inspector joined her, and together they traced a pattern that painted a damning picture. Money donated specifically for the Seeing Eye Dog program had been systematically diverted through the General Operating Fund, and from there into Harold Finchley's personal accounts, where it had funded a lifestyle considerably more luxurious than his legitimate income would support. Mrs. Finchley had sank into a chair, her face ashen. "I don't believe it," she whispered. "Harold would never steal. He was always so particular about honesty, so proud of his reputation." Miss Marple felt genuine sympathy for the woman's distress. "Mrs. Finchley," she said gently, "did your husband have any significant debts or financial pressures that might have tempted him towards such actions?" Mrs. Finchley shook her head slowly. "We lived comfortably, but not extravagantly. At least she paused, frowning. There were those trips to London. Harold said they were for business, but they seemed rather frequent. And he did insist on purchasing a new motor car last year, though I thought our old one was perfectly adequate. Inspector Slack had continued his examination of the personal bank statements and now drew attention to a series of regular withdrawals, each for substantial amounts and each marked simply cash. These withdrawals, he noted, began approximately 18 months ago and continued monthly until just last week. Miss Marple studied the pattern with growing interest. The amounts were not random but followed a careful progression, starting modestly and gradually, increasing over time. To her experienced eye, this suggested not personal expenditure, but rather some form of regular payment to a third party. "Blackmail," she said quietly. "These withdrawals have the characteristic pattern of blackmail payments." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. Someone knew about the embezzlement and was extorting money from Mr. Finchley to keep silent. But who, Mrs. Finchley asked desperately, who would do such a thing? "That," Miss Marple replied, "is a question that bears careful consideration. Someone who knew about the financial irregularities, but chose to profit from the knowledge rather than expose it. Someone who might have been observing Mr. Finchley's activities closely enough to detect the discrepancies." The inspector consulted his notes. Thomas Whitmore questioned the finances about a month ago. Could he have discovered the embezzlement then, and decided to blackmail Mr. Finchley rather than report him? Miss Marple considered this possibility with a careful deliberation she applied to all theories. "It's possible," she conceded. "Mr. Whitmore certainly had motive to be angry with Mr. Finchley, and he equally certainly needs money for his daughter's care." However, she paused, examining the bank statements more closely. These payments began 18 months ago, long before Mr. Whitmore began asking questions. "So we're looking for someone who discovered the embezzlement 18 months ago," Inspector Slack concluded. "Someone with access to the club's financial information, but who chose to exploit it rather than expose it." Mrs. Bantry arrived while they were still examining the records, having heard about the investigation and feeling a neighbourly obligation to support Mrs. Finchley. She listened with growing dismay as the extent of her husband's financial malfeasance became clear. "But surely someone else in the Lions Club should have noticed these irregularities," Mrs. Bantry protested. "Didn't they have a treasurer or someone who reviewed the accounts?" Mrs. Finchley dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Harold was both president and treasurer. He said it was more efficient that way, prevented confusion about who was responsible for what." "That's highly irregular for a charitable organisation," Inspector Slack observed. "Most groups require separation of duties precisely to prevent this sort of situation." Miss Marple had been studying a calendar that hung on the wall behind Mr. Finchley's desk, noting various appointments and reminders marked in his neat handwriting. One entry in particular caught her attention, dated approximately 19 months previous. "Inspector," she said, drawing his attention to the calendar. "Observe this notation. New board member orientation. Perhaps we should determine who joined the Lions Club board around that time." The inspector consulted his notes from earlier interviews. According to several witnesses, the most recent addition to the board was approximately 2 years ago. A Mr. Geoffrey Crane moved to the village from London and quickly became active in community affairs. Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring of intuition. Mr. Crane would bear investigation, she observed. Someone with a background in London might well have the sophistication to recognise financial irregularities and to exploit them effectively. Mrs. Bantry looked troubled. Geoffrey Crane has always seemed perfectly respectable. He runs the new antique shop on the high street, very popular with visitors. "Respectability," Miss Marple replied gently, "is often the most effective disguise for those engaged in less respectable activities." Inspector Slack had already dispatched a constable to locate Mr. Crane and request his presence for an interview. In the meantime, the examination of Mr. Finchley's papers continued, revealing layer upon layer of financial deception that had been carefully concealed beneath the facade of charitable good works. A locked drawer in the desk required some effort to open, but when Inspector Slack finally managed to spring the mechanism, its contents proved illuminating. Inside lay a series of letters, all written in the same flowing hand and all unsigned. The content of these letters removed any doubt about the blackmail theory. "Dear Mr. Finchley," the first letter began, I've become aware of certain discrepancies in the Lions Club accounts that I'm sure you would prefer to remain private. I propose a mutually beneficial arrangement. Subsequent letters outlined the terms of this arrangement with business-like precision. Monthly payments in exchange for continued silence. Gradual increases as the embezzlement continued. And always the underlying threat that exposure would mean professional ruin, criminal prosecution, and public disgrace. Mrs. Finchley had grown progressively more distressed as these letters were read aloud. "My poor Harold," she whispered, "to be trapped in such a terrible situation. No wonder he seemed so anxious these past months." Miss Marple examined the letters carefully, noting several details that struck her as significant. The paper was good quality but unremarkable, purchasable at any stationer's shop. The handwriting was educated and precise, suggesting someone comfortable with written communication. And most interestingly, there were no specific references to how the writer had discovered the embezzlement, which might have provided clues to their identity. Inspector Slack carefully bagged the letters as evidence. These will need to be analysed by handwriting experts. If we can match this writing to someone in the village, we'll have our blackmailer. And possibly, Miss Marple added quietly, we'll have Mr. Finchley's killer. Someone who knew about the embezzlement and was profiting from it might well have decided that eliminating Mr. Finchley was safer than continuing to extract payments. This suggestion brought a moment of thoughtful silence. If the blackmailer had indeed turned to murder, it would fundamentally alter the investigation's focus. Thomas Whitmore might be innocent, his suspicious behaviour merely coincidental rather than indicative of guilt. Mrs. Bantry voiced what they were all thinking. But if the blackmailer killed Harold to silence him permanently, why do it in such a public way? Why not something more private, where suspicion might be avoided entirely? An excellent question, Miss Marple replied. One that suggests either supreme confidence or desperate necessity. Perhaps both. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the return of Inspector Slack's constable, accompanied by a tall, distinguished-looking gentleman of perhaps 45 years. Geoffrey Crane presented an imposing figure, with silver-touched dark hair and the polished manner of someone accustomed to moving in refined society. "Mr. Crane," Inspector Slack said formally, "thank you for coming. I have some questions regarding your relationship with Harold Finchley and your position on the Lions Club board." Geoffrey Crane's expression remained perfectly composed. "Of course, Inspector, though I must confess I'm puzzled about why my relationship with poor Harold should be relevant to his tragic death. It was my understanding he suffered some form of medical emergency." "We're exploring all possibilities," Inspector Slack replied neutrally. "Now then, when did you first become aware of irregularities in the club's financial records?" The directness of the question brought a flicker of surprise to Crane's polished exterior, quickly suppressed. "I'm not certain what you mean, Inspector. Mr. Finchley maintained impeccable records," Miss Marple interjected gently. "Mr. Crane, we have evidence suggesting that someone discovered Mr. Finchley's embezzlement approximately 18 months ago and began blackmailing him. The timing corresponds exactly with your joining the Lions Club board." Geoffrey Crane's composure had begun to crack, subtle tells appearing in his body language. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, now clenched slightly. His breathing, previously even, became slightly elevated. "I'm sure I don't know anything about blackmail," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Inspector Slack produced the letters from Mr. Finchley's desk. "Perhaps you'd care to explain why the handwriting in these letters bears a striking resemblance to the signature on your Lions Club membership application." The silence that followed was answer enough. Geoffrey Crane's carefully constructed facade crumbled, and he sank into a chair with the defeated air of someone who recognizes that the game is up. "Very well," he said quietly. "Yes, I discovered Harold's embezzlement. Yes, I demanded payments in exchange for my silence, but I swear to you I had nothing to do with his death." Miss Marple observed him carefully, noting the genuine distress in his manner. "Mr. Crane," she said gently, "if you're innocent of murder, then helping us understand the full situation would be in your best interest." Geoffrey Crane looked up at her with something like gratitude for her reasonable tone. "I moved to St. Mary Mead 18 months ago," he began. "My antique business in London had failed, leaving me with substantial debts. I saw joining the Lions Club as a way to establish myself in the community, to build the relationships necessary for my new shop's success. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. As a board member, I naturally had access to the financial records. I noticed almost immediately that the numbers didn't add up. Donations earmarked for the Seeing Eye Dog program were being diverted, but no dogs were being provided. It didn't take long to trace the funds to Harold's personal accounts. And so, you decided to profit from your discovery rather than report it. Inspector Slack's tone carried unmistakable disapproval. Crane nodded miserably. I rationalized it by telling myself that exposing Harold would hurt the entire organization, damage public trust in charitable works. But the truth is, I needed the money desperately. My creditors were threatening legal action. I saw an opportunity and I took it. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Mr. Crane, did Mr. Finchley ever express fear about being exposed by someone other than yourself? Did he mention any other threats or concerns? Crane considered the question. About a month ago, he seemed particularly agitated. Said something about the situation becoming more complicated, that more people were asking questions. I assumed he was referring to Thomas Whitmore's inquiries about the program finances. But perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, there was someone else. Another person who had discovered the embezzlement and who posed a different kind of threat. Inspector Slack had been taking notes throughout this conversation. Mr. Crane, where were you this morning between 7 and 8 o'clock? At home, preparing to open my shop, Crane replied. I don't typically attend the Pancake breakfast, I'm afraid. Too much business to attend to on New Year's Day, clearing inventory and planning for the new year. Can anyone corroborate your whereabouts? The inspector pressed. Crane hesitated. I live alone, Inspector. I have no alibi, if that's what you're asking. But I give you my word I had no reason to kill Harold. His death ends my income from the blackmail. Why would I eliminate my source of funds? It was a logical point, one that Miss Marple found compelling, despite Crane's admitted criminal behaviour. A blackmailer profits from keeping his victim alive, not from killing him. Inspector Slack was less easily convinced. You're under arrest for blackmail, Mr. Crane. We'll sort out the question of murder once we've completed our investigation of this morning's events. As Crane was led away in handcuffs, Miss Marple reflected that the case was growing more complex with each new revelation. They now had 2 men in custody, one arrested for murder and one for blackmail. But neither arrest brought her any closer to feeling certain they had identified Harold Finchley's true killer. The truth, she sensed, still lay hidden beneath layers of deception and misdirection. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone who had committed murder on New Year's morning was watching the investigation unfold, perhaps congratulating themselves on how effectively they had directed suspicion toward Thomas Whitmore. The question was who, and more importantly, how could she prove it before an innocent man paid the price for someone else's crime? Chapter 5. Bottles and batter in the village hall kitchen. The following morning found Miss Marple back at the village hall, where Inspector Slack had arranged for a comprehensive forensic examination of the scene. The hall remained sealed to the public, its festive decorations now incongruous reminders of the tragedy that had unfolded there. The inspector had reluctantly agreed to Miss Marple's request to accompany the forensic team, recognizing that her observations had already proven valuable despite his initial skepticism. Dr. Morrison had joined them as well, bringing his medical expertise to bear on the question of exactly how the poison had been administered. He stood near the breakfast table where Harold Finchley had taken his fatal meal, examining the contaminated syrup pitcher with professional interest. The laboratory analysis confirms ethylene glycol, he announced, antifreeze, mixed with maple syrup in a concentration sufficient to be lethal, with relatively small ingestion. Given Mr. Finchley's enthusiasm for syrup on his pancakes, the dose he received would have been more than adequate to cause his death. Miss Marple had been examining the 3 batter bowls that still sat where they had been positioned on the morning of the breakfast. Each one remained exactly as it had been found, sealed as evidence pending complete analysis. She noted again the careful labelling, the identical appearance of the contents, the meticulous organization that had characterized the entire preparation process. Inspector, she said thoughtfully, Might I ask whether the batter itself has been tested for contamination? Inspector Slack consulted his notes. The initial tests focused on the syrup given Dr. Morrison's suspicions. However, standard protocol requires testing all food items that were available to the deceased. Why do you ask? Because, Miss Marple replied, gesturing toward the bowls, if the killer wished to target Mr. Finchley specifically, rather than cause random casualties, he or she would need some way of ensuring that only Mr. Finchley received the poisoned syrup. Contaminating a specific pitcher would achieve that goal only if the killer could control which pitcher Mr. Finchley used. Dr. Morrison joined them at the batter station. That's an excellent point, Miss Marple. In the chaos of a busy breakfast service, there would be no way to guarantee which pitcher any particular person might use unless, he paused, considering, unless the victim was somehow directed to use a specific pitcher. Mrs. Bantry had arrived during this exchange, bringing fresh tea for the investigators. She set down her tray and leaned in to examine the batter bowls. I helped prepare these, she said. We were most careful to make them identical so that no matter which bowl was used, the pancakes would be consistently good. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Mrs. Bantry, can you recall whether all 3 bowls were used during the breakfast service, or whether some remained untouched? Mrs. Bantry furrowed her brow in concentration. We used bowl 1 first, I'm certain of that. It was positioned closest to the griddles. Bowl 2 was brought into service when bowl 1 ran low. But bowl 3, she paused, trying to remember. I don't believe bowl 3 was ever used. The tragedy occurred before we needed it. Inspector Slack had immediately grasped the significance of this observation. So if someone knew that only bowls 1 and 2 would be in active use, they could ensure that bowl 3 remained sealed and pristine, potentially containing evidence that would point to the true method of murder. He carefully lifted bowl 3, noting that its contents appeared slightly different from the others now that he examined them closely. The batter seemed marginally thicker, and there was a faint discoloration that might have been imperceptible in the dim lighting of early morning, but was unmistakable in the bright daylight now flooding through the hall's windows. Dr. Morrison leaned in for a closer look. I'd like to have this tested immediately. If my suspicions are correct, this batter has been contaminated as well, possibly with the same ethylene glycol found in the syrup. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A belt and braces approach, one might say. Poison in both the batter and the syrup, ensuring that Mr. Finchley would receive a fatal dose regardless of which pancake he ate or how much syrup he applied. But that would mean the killer needed access to both the batter preparation and the syrup station, Inspector Slack observed. Who had such access? Mrs. Bantry consulted a volunteer list that she had brought with her. The batter was prepared late yesterday evening by myself, Mrs. Price Ridley, and Nurse Pell. We worked in the hall's kitchen, measuring and mixing according to the club's traditional recipe. The bowls were then covered and left in the refrigerator overnight. And the syrup station, Miss Marple prompted. Thomas Whitmore was in charge of the syrup station from the time he arrived at 7 o'clock, Mrs. Bantry confirmed, though obviously anyone who arrived early might have had access before he began his duties. Inspector Slack made notes in his official book. So, we need to determine who had access to both the kitchen last night and the hall before 7 o'clock this morning. That should narrow our suspect list considerably. Miss Marple had moved into the kitchen itself, a utilitarian space equipped with commercial-grade appliances and substantial storage. The refrigerator where the batter bowls had been stored overnight stood open, revealing several other items that had been kept cold for the breakfast service. On a shelf near the refrigerator she noticed a collection of bottles that caught her attention. "Inspector Slack," she called out. "I believe these may be relevant." The inspector joined her, examining the bottles she indicated. They appeared to be maple syrup bottles from the Sanderson farm, each one bearing the distinctive label that had been on all the donated syrup. But these bottles had been opened, their caps loosened, and their contents diminished. Mrs. Bantry peered at the bottles with evident confusion. Those shouldn't be here. All the syrup was supposed to have been brought to the main hall for decanting into pitchers. Why would opened bottles be left in the kitchen? Miss Marple lifted one of the bottles carefully, noting its weight and the way the liquid moved within. "This appears to be genuine maple syrup," she observed. but I wonder whether these bottles might have served a different purpose. Dr. Morrison had joined them, his medical training providing insight. If someone wished to mix antifreeze with maple syrup to disguise the taste and appearance, they would need to experiment with ratios. Too much antifreeze, and the consistency would be wrong. Too little, and the dose might not be fatal. These bottles could represent test batches, attempts to find the perfect mixture. Inspector Slack was already arranging for the bottles to be seized as evidence. We'll have them analysed immediately. If they contain varying concentrations of ethylene glycol, it will confirm that someone was indeed practicing their poisoning technique. Miss Marple had noticed something else, a small notebook tucked behind the bottles on the shelf. She carefully extracted it, noting that its pages were filled with what appeared to be chemical calculations and measurements. Ethylene glycol properties. One page was headed, lethal dose estimations, maple syrup viscosity comparisons. This, she announced quietly, is a poisoner's handbook. Someone has been researching and planning this murder with considerable care and scientific precision. Inspector Slack examined the notebook with grim satisfaction. If we can match this handwriting to someone in the village, we'll have our killer. Dr. Morrison, do these calculations suggest someone with medical or pharmaceutical training? The doctor studied the notebook carefully. Not necessarily medical training, but certainly someone with a scientific education. The calculations are sophisticated, showing understanding of pharmacology and toxicology. This isn't the work of a casual poisoner, but of someone who approached murder as a technical problem requiring careful solution. Mrs. Bantry had grown pale during this examination. Who in St. Mary Mead would have such knowledge, and why would they use it for such terrible purposes? Miss Marple was consulting her mental catalogue of village residents and their various backgrounds. Nurse Pell has medical training, she observed, though her expertise is in patient care rather than pharmacology. Mrs. Price Ridley's late husband was a chemist, and she might have retained some of his reference books. And then there's Mr. Crane, whose antique business might require knowledge of chemicals for restoration work. Inspector Slack added another name to the list, and Thomas Whitmore, as a farmer, would necessarily have some knowledge of chemicals, pesticides, and their effects. The investigation continued throughout the morning as the forensic team systematically processed every surface and container in both the main hall and the kitchen. The preliminary analysis of Bowl 3 confirmed Dr. Morrison's suspicions. The batter had indeed been contaminated with ethylene glycol, mixed in at a concentration that would have ensured anyone eating pancakes made from that batch would become seriously ill if not fatally poisoned. However, Inspector Slack noted, Bowl 3 was never used for actual cooking, which means the contaminated batter never reached any potential victims except through the killer's plan going awry somehow. Unless, Miss Marple suggested, the contaminated batter was meant as a backup. Perhaps the killer wasn't certain that Mr. Finchley would use the poisoned syrup pitcher, so the batter provided insurance that he would receive a fatal dose regardless. Dr. Morrison shook his head slowly. But that creates a problem. If the killer couldn't control which syrup pitcher Mr. Finchley used, they also couldn't control which batter bowl was used to make his pancakes. How could they ensure he got the contaminated batch? Miss Marple stood very still, her mind working through the implications of this observation. Unless, she said, slowly the killer didn't intend for Mr. Finchley to be the only victim. Unless the entire event was meant to be poisoned, with everyone who attended the breakfast at risk. The horror of this suggestion silenced them all for a moment. Mrs. Bantry sank into a nearby chair, her face ashen. But that would be mass murder. Who would do such a monstrous thing? Someone, Miss Marple replied quietly, who wanted to ensure that their specific target died, but was willing to sacrifice innocent lives to conceal their true purpose. Someone who understood that a single poisoning would lead to intensive investigation and likely exposure, but a mass casualty event might be attributed to contaminated food from the supplier, deflecting suspicion from any individual. Inspector Slack's expression had grown thunderous. You're suggesting this wasn't about revenge on Mr. Finchley specifically, but about creating chaos that would obscure the killer's true motive. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Consider how the investigation has proceeded thus far. We've focused on people with reasons to hate Mr. Finchley, on his embezzlement, on the Seeing Eye Dog program. But what if those are all red herrings? What if the killer wanted us to focus on those motives precisely because they would lead us away from the truth? Mrs. Bantry struggled to process this theory, but the poisoned food wasn't distributed widely. Mr. Finchley was the only casualty. Surely that means he was specifically targeted. Or, Miss Marple countered gently, it means the killer's plan was interrupted before it could reach fruition. Remember, the tragedy occurred early in the breakfast service. Most of the batter remained unused. Most of the syrup pitchers hadn't yet been distributed to tables. The killer's full plan was thwarted by Mr. Finchley's rapid death, which drew immediate attention and halted the breakfast before others could be poisoned. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. That would explain the high concentration of poison in what Mr. Finchley consumed. The killer wanted to ensure rapid death, not a slow decline that might allow for medical intervention. Quick casualties would create panic and confusion, making it harder to trace the contamination to its source. Inspector Slack was already revising his suspect list and his approach to the investigation. If this theory is correct, we need to look beyond people with motives against Mr. Finchley specifically. We need to identify anyone in St. Mary Mead who might have reason to commit mass murder, or who might benefit from the chaos such an event would create. Miss Marple moved to stand by the hall's tall windows, looking out at the peaceful village scene beyond. The truth was there somewhere, hidden among the familiar faces and comfortable routines of St. Mary Mead life. Someone who attended the same church services, shopped at the same stores, greeted neighbours with the same pleasant courtesies, all while harbouring murderous intent and the willingness to kill indiscriminately to achieve their goals. It was a chilling thought, made more so by the realization that the killer had come terrifyingly close to success. Only the accident of Mr. Finchley serving himself early, before the contaminated food could be widely distributed, had prevented a catastrophe that might have claimed dozens of innocent lives. The question now was how to identify the killer before they could attempt another such atrocity, because Miss Marple was increasingly certain that someone willing to plan mass murder once would not hesitate to try again if they felt their initial attempt had failed. Chapter 6. Nurse Pell's neat notes and a damning detail. The afternoon brought another development in the investigation when Nurse Pell requested to speak with Inspector Slack, claiming she had remembered something potentially significant about the breakfast preparations. Miss Marple accompanied the inspector to the village hall, where they found the nurse waiting with evident anxiety. Nurse Pell was a woman of perhaps 40 years, with the sturdy build and practical manner typical of her profession. She had served St. Mary Mead's community for more than a decade, attending births, caring for the elderly, and providing medical support when Dr. Haydock's services were not immediately required. Her reputation was impeccable, her dedication unquestioned. "Inspector," she began without preamble, "I've been thinking about the batter preparation, and there's something that doesn't sit right with me." Inspector Slack produced his notebook. "I'm listening, Nurse Pell. When Mrs. Bantry, Mrs. Price Ridley and I prepared the batter yesterday evening, we followed the traditional recipe exactly. 3 bowls, identical measurements, mixed with the same technique." "We were most careful about consistency," Miss Marple interjected gently. "But something troubled you about the process." Nurse Pell nodded, her expression troubled. "After we finished, we covered the bowls and placed them in the refrigerator, as Mrs. Bantry mentioned. But I realized this morning, while thinking back over events, that when I arrived at the hall at 6:30 to begin setting up, I noticed that the refrigerator door was slightly ajar." Inspector Slack leaned forward with interest. "Ajar? Are you certain?" "Quite certain. I remember because I pushed it firmly closed, concerned that the temperature might have risen and affected the batter. But, at the time, I thought perhaps someone had simply been careless when checking supplies. Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, someone had deliberately opened the refrigerator to access the batter bowls." Nurse Pell's face reflected her distress at this possibility. "I'm afraid that's exactly what I've come to suspect. And there's something else. When we prepared the batter, we used Mrs. Bantry's large measuring cups, which she brought from home specifically for that purpose. But this morning, when I was tidying the kitchen after, After Mr. Finchley's death, I found a different set of measuring cups in the sink, ones I didn't recognise. Inspector Slack's interest was palpable. Can you describe these measuring cups? They were metal, quite old-fashioned, with measurements marked in both imperial and metric units. Mrs. Bantry's cups are modern plastic, marked only in imperial measurements. These were definitely not the ones we used for the batter preparation. Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of intuition that accompanied a significant clue. Nurse Pell, did you notice anything else unusual about these measuring cups? Any residue or unusual smell? Nurse Pell hesitated, then nodded slowly. Now that you mention it, there was a faint, sweet smell, rather like the maple syrup, but not quite the same, and the cups had a slightly sticky residue despite having been rinsed. That would be consistent with someone using those cups to measure and mix ethylene glycol with maple syrup, Dr. Morrison observed. The residue would remain, even after a casual rinsing, and the sweet smell would be characteristic of antifreeze. Inspector Slack was already moving toward the kitchen. Where are these measuring cups now, Nurse Pell? I'm afraid I washed them properly, not realizing they might be important, Nurse Pell replied, her distress evident. They're in the drying rack beside the sink. The measuring cups proved to be exactly as Nurse Pell had described, old-fashioned metal vessels with clear measurement markings. Despite having been thoroughly washed, they might still yield forensic evidence if examined by experts with the proper equipment. Inspector Slack carefully bagged them as evidence, then turned back to Nurse Pell. Can you think of anyone who might have had access to the hall between the time you left last evening and the time you arrived this morning? Nurse Pell considered the question carefully. The hall is typically locked at night, but several people have keys. Mrs. Bantry, of course, as she coordinates many of the village events. Mr. Finchley had one as club president, and I believe the vicar has one as well, since church groups sometimes use the hall for meetings. Miss Marple had been examining the kitchen with renewed attention, noting the careful organisation that characterised the space. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure their poisoning attempt would succeed, yet they had made mistakes. The measuring cups left in the sink, the refrigerator door left ajar, the experimental bottles left on the shelf. These were not the errors of a careful planner, but rather the oversights of someone working under time pressure or emotional stress. Inspector, she said thoughtfully, I wonder whether we might request that everyone who had access to the hall provide samples of their handwriting. We have the notebook with the poison calculations, and we have the blackmail letters to Mr. Finchley. If we can match the handwriting, we may identify our killer. Inspector Slack nodded approval of this suggestion. A sound approach, Miss Marple. I'll arrange for handwriting samples to be collected from everyone involved with the breakfast preparation. As they prepared to leave the kitchen, Miss Marple noticed something that had escaped her attention during previous examinations. Tucked beneath the sink, partially hidden by cleaning supplies, was a small bottle bearing no label. She carefully extracted it and held it up to the light, noting the thick, clear liquid within. Inspector Slack immediately recognized the significance of this discovery. That appears to be antifreeze. Pure, undiluted antifreeze. Nurse Pell drew closer, her professional training evident in her careful examination, without touching the evidence. The bottle's about half empty. If that's the source of the poison used in the syrup and batter, there should be enough remaining to definitively match it to the contamination found in Mr. Finchley's breakfast. Miss Marple set the bottle down carefully on the counter. This is a most curious discovery. The killer went to such trouble to conceal their activities, yet they left the source of the poison in a location where it would inevitably be found during a thorough search. Unless, Dr. Morrison suggested, they were interrupted before they could dispose of it properly, or perhaps they intended to return later to retrieve it, but were prevented by the investigation sealing the hall. Inspector Slack was already arranging for the bottle to be processed as evidence. We'll have the laboratory compare this antifreeze with the contamination found in the food. If it's a match, we can at least confirm that the murder weapon came from within the hall itself, rather than being brought from outside. The analysis was expedited given the serious nature of the crime, and by late afternoon the results confirmed what they had suspected. The antifreeze found beneath the sink was chemically identical to the poison discovered in both the syrup and the batter. Moreover, Fingerprint analysis revealed multiple partial prints on the bottle, though they were smudged and incomplete. Miss Marple received this news while taking tea with Mrs. Bantry at the latter's comfortable home. The two women had been friends for many years, and Mrs. Bantry had found herself deeply shaken by the revelation that someone she knew, someone who had worked alongside her in preparing the breakfast, might be a murderer. "I simply cannot comprehend it, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, her teacup rattling slightly against its saucer. "To think that while we were mixing batter and arranging tables, someone was plotting to poison potentially dozens of people. It makes me feel quite ill." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand with gentle sympathy. "Evil often wears a familiar face, Dolly. That is what makes it so particularly insidious. We expect villains to appear villainous, but in reality they often look exactly like everyone else." "But who could it be?" Mrs. Bantry pressed. "We've known most of these people for years. Nurse Pell has delivered half the babies in the village. Mrs. Price Ridley, for all her faults, has supported every charitable cause. Even Mr. Crane, despite his blackmail, doesn't strike me as capable of mass murder." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "That is precisely the question that troubles me. The evidence suggests careful planning and scientific knowledge, yet it also suggests mistakes that a truly careful planner would not make. It's as though we're dealing with two different personalities, one who plans meticulously and one who acts impulsively." Mrs. Bantry set down her teacup with sudden resolution. "Jane, you don't suppose there could be two people involved? A partnership of some kind?" The suggestion brought Miss Marple up short. She had been so focused on identifying a single killer that she had not seriously considered the possibility of accomplices. Yet now that Mrs. Bantry had voiced the idea, it began to make a certain terrible sense. "Partnership would explain many of the inconsistencies," Miss Marple said slowly. "One person with the scientific knowledge to prepare the poison, another with the access and opportunity to contaminate the food. One person to plan, another to execute. But who would work together for such a terrible purpose?" Mrs. Bantry wondered. Miss Marple's mind was already sorting through the various relationships and connections among the suspects. Thomas Whitmore and his daughter Sarah, bound by familial love and desperation. Geoffrey Crane and some unknown accomplice, motivated by financial gain. Or perhaps a combination that no one had yet considered. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who appeared at Mrs. Bantry's door with news of a significant development. The handwriting analysis had been completed, and the results were both illuminating and deeply disturbing. The notebook with the poison calculations, the inspector announced without preamble, was written by Nurse Pell. Chapter 7. The Nurse's Confession and a Daughter's Deception. The revelation that Nurse Pell had authored the poisoner's handbook sent shockwaves through the investigation. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry accompanied Inspector Slack to the police station, where Nurse Pell sat in an interview room, her normally composed features reflecting a mixture of resignation and defiance. Inspector Slack wasted no time with pleasantries. "Nurse Pell, we have conclusive evidence that you wrote the notebook containing detailed calculations about ethylene glycol poisoning. I'm giving you an opportunity to explain yourself before I proceed with formal charges." Nurse Pell met his gaze steadily, her hands folded calmly on the table before her. "Yes, I wrote that notebook. But I did not murder Harold Finchley, nor did I attempt to poison anyone at the Pancake breakfast." Inspector Slack's expression reflected profound skepticism. "You expect me to believe that you researched lethal doses of antifreeze, calculated optimal mixing ratios with maple syrup, and documented all of this in meticulous detail, but had no intention of actually using that information to commit murder." Nurse Pell's composure remained intact despite the aggressive questioning. "I expect you to investigate thoroughly before jumping to conclusions, Inspector. Yes, I researched antifreeze poisoning. Yes, I made calculations and took notes. But I did so for a very specific reason that had nothing to do with murdering anyone." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle. "Perhaps you might explain that reason, Nurse Pell. I'm sure we would all benefit from understanding the context of your research." Nurse Pell glanced at Miss Marple gratefully, clearly appreciating the more reasonable approach. 3 months ago, I was called to attend to a child who had accidentally ingested antifreeze from a container in his father's garage. The child survived, thankfully, but the experience troubled me deeply. I realised that many people in the village, particularly those with farms or vehicles, keep antifreeze readily accessible without understanding just how dangerous it is. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. I decided to prepare an educational presentation for the parish council, warning about the dangers of antifreeze poisoning and providing information about safe storage and what to do in case of accidental ingestion. The notebook was my research for that presentation. Inspector Slack remained unconvinced. A convenient explanation, Nurse Pell, but it doesn't explain why that notebook was found hidden in the village hall kitchen alongside bottles that appear to have been used for testing poison mixtures. Nurse Pell's composure finally cracked slightly. The notebook wasn't hidden. I kept it in my medical bag, which I brought to the hall on the morning of the breakfast. As for where it was found, I cannot explain that. Someone must have taken it from my bag and placed it where you discovered it. Miss Marple intervened again, her keen mind sorting through the implications. Nurse Pell, when did you last see your medical bag on the morning of the breakfast? Nurse Pell considered the question. I set it down in the kitchen when I arrived at 6:30, as I wanted both hands free for setting up tables. I didn't return to retrieve it until after Mr. Finchley's collapse, when Dr. Haydock called for first aid supplies, and during that time, anyone in the hall might have accessed your bag and removed the notebook, Miss Marple observed. Inspector Slack looked annoyed at this line of reasoning. You're suggesting someone deliberately framed Nurse Pell by stealing her research notes and using them as part of their murder plan. I'm suggesting, Miss Marple replied calmly, that we should consider all possibilities before concluding that the most obvious suspect is necessarily the guilty party. The inspector turned back to Nurse Pell with renewed intensity. Very well. Let's discuss your whereabouts between the time you left the hall last evening and your arrival this morning. Can you account for those hours? Nurse Pell nodded firmly. I left the hall around 9 o'clock after we finished preparing the batter. I went directly home, where I spent the evening reviewing my medical journals and preparing for a patient visit scheduled for today. I live alone, so I have no one who can corroborate this, but I was definitely at home. Inspector Slack made notes in his official book. And you noticed nothing unusual when you arrived at the hall this morning, apart from the refrigerator door being ajar. Nurse Pell hesitated, then spoke carefully. Actually, there was something else. When I entered the kitchen, I thought I heard footsteps in the main hall as though someone had just left quickly. But when I looked, I saw no one. I assumed it was one of the other volunteers arriving early. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken slightly. This was significant. If someone had been in the hall before Nurse Pell's arrival, that person might have been contaminating the food supplies. And if they had heard Nurse Pell entering, they might have hastily concealed their activities, leaving behind evidence they had intended to remove. What time was this? She asked. 6:30, or perhaps a few minutes after, Nurse Pell replied. I'm quite certain of the time because I checked my watch when I noticed the refrigerator door ajar, concerned about how long the batter might have been exposed to warmer temperatures. Inspector Slack's expression suggested he was beginning to reconsider his certainty about Nurse Pell's guilt. If someone else was in the hall at 6:30, we need to identify them. Who else had keys to the hall and might have arrived that early? Mrs. Bantry had been listening intently to this exchange. I arrived around 7 o'clock, she offered, and Thomas Whitmore arrived shortly before me, perhaps 6:50. But I don't know who might have been there. Earlier, the investigation seemed to have reached a crucial juncture. Either Nurse Pell was lying about hearing footsteps, creating a fictional intruder to deflect suspicion from herself, or someone else had been in the hall during the critical window when the food contamination likely occurred. Miss Marple requested permission to examine Nurse Pell's medical bag, which had been secured as evidence. The inspector granted this request grudgingly, and Miss Marple carefully investigated the bag's contents. Medical supplies, prescription pads, reference cards for various conditions, all organised with the precise efficiency one would expect from an experienced nurse. What caught Miss Marple's attention, however, was a small tear in the bag's inner lining, as though something had been forcibly removed. The notebook might have been kept in this concealed pocket, she observed, showing the tear to Inspector Slack. If someone knew it was there and wanted to steal it, They might have damaged the lining in their haste. This physical evidence supporting Nurse Pell's account seemed to give the inspector pause. He studied the tear carefully, then looked at Nurse Pell with slightly less hostility. "We'll need to verify your story about the educational presentation. If the parish council can confirm you had requested time to speak about antifreeze safety, it will support your explanation for the research." The verification came more quickly than anyone anticipated. A telephone call to the vicar confirmed that Nurse Pell had indeed approached him 2 months earlier about presenting safety information at a parish council meeting, specifically mentioning antifreeze poisoning as a significant risk in rural communities. Inspector Slack set down the telephone with obvious frustration. "It appears your explanation is accurate, Nurse Pell. However, that doesn't entirely clear you of suspicion. You still had the knowledge and the opportunity to contaminate the food." Before Nurse Pell could respond, a constable entered with urgent news. "Inspector, we've had a development. Sarah Whitmore has requested to speak with you immediately. She claims she has information about her father's involvement that she initially withheld." The small interview room seemed even more cramped with Sarah Whitmore seated across from Inspector Slack, her white cane resting against her chair and her unseeing eyes fixed in the general direction of the inspector's voice. Miss Marple had positioned herself where she could observe Sarah's expressions and body language, noting the young woman's evident agitation. "Miss Whitmore," Inspector Slack began, "I understand you have additional information about the events of New Year's morning." Sarah's hands twisted in her lap, her distress palpable. "I lied to you," she said quietly. "When I told you I heard my father in the garage that morning, pouring liquids, I wasn't being entirely truthful about what I heard." Inspector Slack leaned forward with sharp interest. "What exactly did you hear, Miss Whitmore?" Sarah took a deep breath before continuing. "I heard 2 voices in the garage. My father was speaking with someone else, a woman. I couldn't make out the words clearly, but the tone was urgent, almost conspiratorial. This revelation altered the investigation's trajectory significantly. 2 people in the garage working together, exactly as Mrs. Bantry had speculated." Miss Marple found herself studying Sarah's face intently, searching for any indication that the young woman might be fabricating this account to protect her father. "Can you identify the woman's voice?" Inspector Slack pressed. Sarah shook her head miserably. "I'm blind, Inspector, not deaf." "But I didn't recognize the voice with certainty. It was familiar, someone I've heard before in the village, but I cannot name her specifically," Miss Marple interjected gently. "Sarah, why did you not mention this second person initially? Surely you realized it was significant information." Sarah's face crumpled, tears beginning to flow, "because I was terrified of making things worse for my father. If there was someone else involved, someone who might have manipulated him or threatened him, I thought identifying them might put him in even greater danger. But I can't bear the thought of him being blamed for everything, when someone else might be equally guilty." Inspector Slack's expression had grown thoughtful. "This changes matters considerably. If your father was working with an accomplice, we need to identify that person. Think carefully, Miss Whitmore. Was there anything distinctive about the woman's voice? An accent, a particular phrase she used, anything that might help us narrow down who it was?" Sarah concentrated, her face reflecting intense mental effort. She spoke quickly, as though nervous or excited, and there was something about her tone that suggested authority, like she was accustomed to giving instructions and having them followed. Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition. That description might fit several women in St. Mary Mead, but combined with the other evidence, it began to point in a very specific direction. She glanced at Inspector Slack and saw that he had reached a similar conclusion. The inspector stood abruptly. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming forward with this information. It takes courage to admit you've withheld evidence, and I appreciate your honesty now." He turned to his constable. "Bring in Mrs. Price Ridley for questioning, and do so immediately." Chapter 8. Mrs. Price Ridley's Pride and a Bitter Motive. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived at the police station in a state of high indignation, her considerable bulk quivering with outrage at being summoned for questioning. She swept into the interview room with the air of someone who considered the entire proceeding beneath her dignity and fully expected to be vindicated within minutes. "Inspector Slack," she announced imperiously. "I must protest this treatment most strongly. I'm a pillar of this community, a generous supporter of charitable causes, and I will not be subjected to interrogation like some common criminal." Inspector Slack remained unmoved by this display. "Mrs. Price Ridley, you were one of 3 people who prepared the batter for the pancake breakfast. That places you in a position of particular interest to this investigation." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed disdainfully. "I volunteered my time to help with the breakfast, as I have done for numerous village events over the years. If you're suggesting that my charitable work somehow makes me a murder suspect, you've clearly taken leave of your senses." Miss Marple, who had been observing quietly from her position near the window, spoke gently. "Mrs. Price Ridley, we're not accusing you of anything. We're simply trying to establish everyone's movements and activities on the morning of the breakfast. Surely you can understand the necessity of thorough investigation." Mrs. Price Ridley's expression softened, slightly at Miss Marple's reasonable tone. "Well, I suppose I can appreciate the need for completeness, though I fail to see what my activities could possibly contribute to solving this terrible tragedy." Inspector Slack consulted his notes. "Let's begin with the evening before the breakfast. You helped prepare the batter along with Mrs. Bantry and Nurse Pell. What time did you leave the hall?" "Around 9 o'clock, the same as the others," Mrs. Price Ridley replied. "We finished our work, cleaned the preparation area, and departed together." "And you went directly home?" the inspector pressed. Mrs. Price Ridley hesitated for just a fraction of a second before responding. "Yes, of course I went home. Where else would I go at that hour?" Miss Marple noted the slight pause with interest. "Mrs. Price Ridley, did you perhaps stop anywhere on your way home? Even a brief errand might be relevant to our understanding of the timeline." Mrs. Price Ridley's face had taken on a defensive cast. "If you must. No, I stopped briefly at the Whitmore farm on my way home. Sarah had mentioned needing some magazines for her talking book device, and I had some I'd finished with. It was a simple act of charity, nothing more." Inspector Slack's interest sharpened immediately. "You visited the Whitmore farm. Did you see Thomas Whitmore during this visit?" "Yes," he answered the door, Mrs. Price Ridley acknowledged. "We spoke briefly about Sarah's needs and the Lions Club program. He was quite agitated about the lack of progress in securing a service dog for his daughter." "What specifically did he say?" Miss Marple inquired. Mrs. Price Ridley shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "He said that Harold Finchley had been stealing from the program, that the money donated should have been more than sufficient to help Sarah and others like her. He was quite angry, really most distressed." "And how did you respond to these accusations?" Inspector Slack asked. Mrs. Price Ridley drew herself up with apparent dignity. "I told him I would look into the matter. As someone who has donated generously to the Lions Club over the years, I felt I had a right to know whether the funds were being properly managed." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And did you look into it, Mrs. Price Ridley? Did you examine the club's financial records?" The silence that followed was telling. Mrs. Price Ridley's face had gone pale, and her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "I may have glanced at some papers," she said finally. "Harold had left a ledger at the hall after a recent meeting, and I happened to see it when I was organising supplies." "You happened to see it?" Inspector Slack repeated sceptically. "Or did you deliberately search for it after Thomas Whitmore's accusations prompted you to investigate?" Mrs. Price Ridley's composure was crumbling rapidly. "Very well. Yes, I looked for the ledger deliberately, and what I found was shocking. Harold Finchley had been systematically embezzling from the Seeing Eye dog program, diverting funds that should have gone to help people like Sarah Whitmore. It was unconscionable." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "And having discovered this embezzlement, what did you do with that information?" Mrs. Price Ridley's face reflected a mixture of shame and defiance. "I confronted Harold, of course. I told him I knew what he'd been doing, and I demanded that he make restitution immediately and resign from the club presidency." "When did this confrontation occur?" Inspector Slack demanded. 2 weeks ago," Mrs. Price Ridley admitted. "We met at the hall late one evening when no one else was present. Harold was," she paused, searching for words. "He was dismissive of my concerns. He claimed the money had been used for legitimate expenses, that I didn't understand proper accounting procedures. He essentially called me an interfering old woman. Miss Marple could see the wound this dismissal had inflicted on Mrs. Price Ridley's considerable pride. For a woman who prided herself on her status and influence in the community, such contempt would have been deeply humiliating. "And you told Thomas Whitmore about this confrontation," Miss Marple suggested gently. Mrs. Price Ridley nodded miserably. "I visited the farm again several days later. I told Thomas that I had confirmed his suspicions, that Harold was indeed embezzling, but that he had refused to make things right. I said," she paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, "I said that someone needed to ensure Harold faced consequences for his theft." Inspector Slack's expression had grown very grim indeed. "Mrs. Price Ridley, did you provide Thomas Whitmore with any specific suggestions about how Harold Finchley might be made to face consequences?" The silence stretched out painfully. Finally, Mrs. Price Ridley spoke in a voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. "I may have mentioned that Harold's love of maple syrup was well known. I may have observed that antifreeze, being sweet, might be mistaken for syrup in sufficient quantities. And I may have noted that my late husband's chemistry reference books contained detailed information about various toxic substances." Miss Marple felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. Here finally was the partnership she had suspected. Not two people working together to commit murder, but one person providing knowledge and suggestion, while allowing another to carry out the actual act. "Did you provide Thomas Whitmore with antifreeze?" Inspector Slack asked bluntly. Mrs. Price Ridley shook her head violently. "No, absolutely not. I merely made observations, shared information. What Thomas chose to do with that information was his own decision. I never explicitly told him to poison Harold." "But you knew what you were suggesting," Miss Marple said quietly. "You knew that a desperate father, angry about injustice and determined to help his daughter, might interpret your observations as instructions." Mrs. Price Ridley's face crumpled, and tears began to flow down her powdered cheeks. "I didn't think he would actually do it. I thought perhaps the threat would be enough, that if Harold believed someone might poison him, he would make restitution and resign. I never imagined Thomas would go through with it." Inspector Slack stood, his expression reflecting profound disgust. "Mrs. Price Ridley, you are under arrest as an accessory to murder. You may not have administered the poison yourself, but you provided the knowledge, the means, and the motivation for Thomas Whitmore to commit this crime." As Mrs. Price Ridley was led away, still sobbing and protesting that she had never meant for anyone to die, Miss Marple remained seated by the window, her mind troubled by a detail that didn't quite fit. Something about the entire scenario felt wrong, like a picture frame hanging slightly askew. Inspector Slack returned to the interview room, looking satisfied despite the grim nature of the day's revelations. "Well, Miss Marple, it appears we've solved the case. Thomas Whitmore committed the murder with Mrs. Price Ridley's assistance and encouragement. The evidence supports this conclusion at every turn." Miss Marple looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "Does it, Inspector? Does it really support this conclusion at every turn, or merely at most turns?" Inspector Slack frowned. "What do you mean? We have Sarah Whitmore's testimony about hearing two voices in the garage. We have Mrs. Price Ridley's admission that she encouraged Thomas Whitmore to consider poisoning. We have Thomas Whitmore's suspicious behaviour and his flight from the scene. What more do we need?" Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to stand before the inspector. "We need to explain why an innocent man, because I believe Thomas Whitmore is innocent, would have poisoned syrup in his garage. We need to explain why Mrs. Price Ridley, if she was truly complicit in murder, would have helped prepare the batter that was also contaminated. And most importantly, we need to explain why the poisoning appeared designed to create multiple casualties rather than target Harold Finchley specifically." The inspector's satisfaction faltered. "You're suggesting we've arrested the wrong people." "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that we've arrested people who are certainly guilty of something, but perhaps not guilty of murder. And I'm suggesting that the true killer is still at large, possibly congratulating themselves on how effectively they've manipulated our investigation." Chapter 9. The Second Voice and a Sister's Secret. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her comfortable drawing-room, a pot of tea growing cold on the table beside her, as she reviewed everything she knew about the case. Mrs. Bantry had joined her, providing moral support and occasionally offering observations that, while well-intentioned, did little to clarify the increasingly tangled situation. "I simply cannot believe Mrs. Price Ridley would be party to murder," Mrs. Bantry said for, perhaps the third time. "She's insufferable, certainly, but murderous? It seems quite beyond her." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "That is precisely what troubles me, Dolly. Mrs. Price Ridley is many things: pompous, self-important, often cruel in her casual disregard for others' feelings. But she is not, I think, fundamentally evil. Her confession suggests she provided information without fully considering how it might be used, which is reckless and reprehensible, but different from actively planning murder. But if she didn't plan the murder, and if you believe Thomas Whitmore is innocent, then who did plan it?" Mrs. Bantry asked reasonably. "That," Miss Marple replied, "is the question that has been troubling me all day. We have assumed that the woman Sarah Whitmore heard in her father's garage was Mrs. Price Ridley. But what if we've made an error? What if it was someone else entirely?" Mrs. Bantry looked surprised. But who else would have been there at that early hour, discussing something suspicious enough to make Sarah concerned? Miss Marple rose and began to pace slowly, her mind working through possibilities. Sarah said the voice was familiar, but that she couldn't identify it with certainty. She said the woman spoke with authority, as though accustomed to giving instructions. We assumed this meant Mrs. Price Ridley, but there's another woman in St. Mary Mead who fits that description equally well. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You don't mean—" "Nurse Pell," Miss Marple confirmed. "A woman who speaks with medical authority, who would be comfortable giving instructions, and whose voice would certainly be familiar to Sarah Whitmore from various visits providing medical care." "But Nurse Pell was at home that morning," Mrs. Bantry protested. "She didn't arrive at the hall until 6:30. "No," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Nurse Pell says she was at home that morning, but she lives alone and has no one to corroborate her whereabouts. What if she was actually at the Whitmore farm much earlier, speaking with Thomas Whitmore in his garage?" Mrs. Bantry struggled to process this theory. But why would Nurse Pell be involved with Thomas Whitmore? What possible connection could they have? Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her teacup, finding it had indeed grown too cold to drink. "Consider what we know about Nurse Pell. She's dedicated, hard-working, and deeply committed to helping those in need. She's also someone who would have intimate knowledge of the Whitmore family's situation, having undoubtedly provided medical care to Sarah over the years." "I'm still not following," Mrs. Bantry admitted. "Nurse Pell has medical knowledge, including knowledge of poisons and their effects," Miss Marple continued. "She had access to the village hall and the opportunity to contaminate the food. And most significantly, she had that notebook, the Poisoner's Handbook, which she claimed was for an educational presentation, but which could equally have been genuine preparation for murder." "But the notebook was stolen from her medical bag," Mrs. Bantry reminded her. "You saw the torn lining yourself." "Or," Miss Marple suggested quietly, "Nurse Pell created that torn lining herself to support her story about the notebook being stolen. A simple enough deception for someone who knew the notebook would eventually be discovered." Mrs. Bantry sank back in her chair, looking troubled. "Jane, you're suggesting that Nurse Pell planned and executed this murder, then deliberately created evidence to make herself appear to be a victim of framing." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It would explain many of the inconsistencies that have troubled me. The meticulous planning combined with apparent mistakes, the poisoning that seemed designed to create multiple casualties, even the timing of events. But what would be her motive?" Mrs. Bantry pressed. "Why would Nurse Pell want to kill Harold Finchley?" "That," Miss Marple admitted, "is where my theory encounters difficulty. Nurse Pell had no obvious connection to Harold Finchley beyond general village acquaintance. No financial motive, no personal grudge, no apparent reason to wish him harm." The two women sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in thought. Finally, Mrs. Bantry spoke hesitantly. "Jane, do you remember when the Lions Club first announced their Seeing Eye Dog program?" Miss Marple looked up with interest. "Yes, approximately 2 years ago, if I recall correctly." "Why do you ask?" "Because," Mrs. Bantry said slowly, "I remember there being another candidate besides Sarah Whitmore, someone else who needed a service dog desperately. But then that person withdrew their application rather suddenly, and I never thought to ask why. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. Who was this other candidate, Dolly? Mrs. Bantry frowned, trying to remember. It was someone's sister, I think. Someone who lived outside the village but was supported by a local relative. The name escapes me, but it was definitely discussed at one of the early Lions Club meetings. Miss Marple was already moving toward her telephone. Inspector Slack will need to know about this immediately. If there was another potential beneficiary of the program who was somehow excluded, that could provide the missing motive we've been seeking. The inspector, roused from his evening meal, listened to Miss Marple's theory with initial skepticism that gradually transformed into grudging interest. When she mentioned the possibility of another service dog candidate, his attention sharpened considerably. "I'll have my constables review the Lions Club records tonight," he said briskly. "If there was another applicant, there will be documentation, and if that applicant was related to someone currently under suspicion, well, that changes everything." The search of the Lions Club records, conducted that same evening, revealed exactly what Miss Marple had suspected. 26 months earlier, a woman named Margaret Pelham had applied for a service dog through the program. Margaret was blind due to complications from diabetes and lived with her sister, who provided daily care while working full-time as the village nurse. Her sister was Nurse Pell. Inspector Slack telephoned Miss Marple with this discovery shortly after midnight, his voice reflecting excitement and vindication. "You were right, Miss Marple. Nurse Pell had a sister who needed a service dog, and her application was one of the first received when the program was announced." "What happened to the application?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It was approved initially," the inspector reported. Margaret Pelham met all the criteria and was placed at the top of the waiting list. But when it came time for actual distribution of dogs, Harold Finchley kept finding reasons to delay. First, it was paperwork issues, then medical evaluations that needed updating, then concerns about whether Margaret's home environment was suitable. Eventually, Margaret gave up and withdrew her application entirely. "When did she withdraw?" Miss Marple inquired. 6 months ago, Inspector Slack replied grimly. "And 3 months later, she died. According to the death certificate, complications from diabetes exacerbated by a fall in her home, a fall that might have been prevented if she'd had a service dog to help her maintain stability and independence." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of this tragedy. So Nurse Pell watched her sister die, knowing that Harold Finchley's embezzlement had directly contributed to that death by preventing Margaret from receiving the assistance she desperately needed. "Exactly," the inspector confirmed. "And that gives Nurse Pell one of the strongest motives we've encountered. Not just anger about embezzlement in the abstract, but personal grief and rage over losing her sister to what she must have perceived as Harold Finchley's greed." Miss Marple thanked the inspector and set down the telephone, her mind already working through the implications. A personal motive explained much, but it also raised new questions. If Nurse Pell had killed Harold Finchley out of revenge for her sister's death, why the elaborate plan that appeared designed to create multiple casualties? Why not simply poison Finchley directly and accept the consequences? Unless, Miss Marple thought, the multiple casualties were never the actual goal. What if the contaminated batter and the multiple bottles of experimental poison were all misdirection, meant to make the murder appear random rather than targeted? What if Nurse Pell had planned from the beginning to kill only Harold Finchley, but had carefully constructed the appearance of a mass poisoning attempt to conceal her true motive? It was a chilling possibility, made more so by its elegance. By appearing to plan an indiscriminate attack, Nurse Pell would deflect suspicion from herself as someone with a specific motive. Investigators would search for someone angry enough to kill randomly rather than looking for personal connections to the victim. But the plan had gone awry somehow. The poison had killed Harold Finchley before widespread distribution could occur, drawing immediate attention and halting the breakfast before others could be affected. And in the investigation that followed, Nurse Pell had been forced to improvise, creating the story about the stolen notebook and attempting to frame both Thomas Whitmore and Mrs. Price Ridley for her crime. Yet even as Miss Marple constructed this theory, she felt the same nagging doubt that had troubled her earlier. Something didn't quite fit. some detail that her subconscious had registered, but that her conscious mind had not yet fully processed. She returned to her drawing room and retrieved the notes she had made throughout the investigation, spreading them across her desk and studying them by lamplight. Somewhere in these observations lay the final piece of the puzzle, the detail that would either confirm her theory about Nurse Pell or reveal yet another layer of deception. It was nearly 2 in the morning when she found it. Chapter 10. The Final Deception and a Blind Woman's Truth. Miss Marple arrived at the police station the following morning to find Inspector Slack already at his desk, reviewing the evidence against Nurse Pell in preparation for a formal arrest. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression reflecting both satisfaction at solving the case and weariness from the long hours of investigation. "Miss Marple," he greeted her, "I was just about to send for Nurse Pell. With the motive established and the physical evidence linking her to the crime, I believe we have sufficient grounds for arrest." Miss Marple settled into the chair across from his desk, her expression unusually grave. "Inspector, before you proceed with that arrest, I wonder whether you might indulge me in one final interview." Inspector Slack looked puzzled. "An interview? With whom? We've already questioned everyone involved." "Not quite everyone," Miss Marple replied quietly. "We've questioned Thomas Whitmore, Mrs. Price Ridley, Nurse Pell, and various others who were present at the breakfast. But there's one person whose testimony we've accepted at face value without truly examining its implications." The inspector frowned. "Who do you mean?" "Sarah Whitmore," Miss Marple said. "The blind woman who claims she heard 2 voices in her father's garage, but couldn't identify the second speaker." Inspector Slack's frown deepened. "Miss Marple, surely you're not suggesting that a blind woman is somehow involved in this murder? That seems quite beyond credibility." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, "I'm suggesting that we've made a terrible error in our assumptions, an error based on our tendency to view certain types of people as inherently helpless or incapable of deception." She rose and moved to stand by the window, looking out at the village that had been her home for so many years. "Inspector, what if I told you that Sarah Whitmore is not actually blind?" The inspector's expression suggested he thought Miss Marple had taken leave of her senses. "Miss Marple, Sarah Whitmore has been blind since birth. This is well-documented medical fact, confirmed by every doctor who has ever examined her." "Has it been confirmed recently?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Or have we all simply assumed that a condition diagnosed in childhood persists unchanged into adulthood?" Inspector Slack opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly uncertain. "To my knowledge, there haven't been recent examinations. Sarah's blindness was considered permanent and irreversible." Miss Marple turned from the window to face him directly. "Last night, while reviewing my notes, I noticed something peculiar. When Sarah came to make her statement about hearing 2 voices in the garage, she navigated the police station with her white cane, tapping it carefully to find her way. Yet, when she visited her father in custody earlier this week, several officers reported that she moved through the corridors with surprising confidence, barely using her cane at all. That could simply mean she's becoming more familiar with the layout," the inspector suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "It could," Miss Marple agreed, "but consider also her behaviour at the pancake breakfast. Mrs. Bantry mentioned to me that Sarah stood near the doorway watching the preparations. That was the word Mrs. Bantry used, watching. At the time, I thought nothing of it, assuming Mrs. Bantry simply meant that Sarah was present and aware of the activity. But what if she meant it literally? What if Sarah was actually watching? Inspector Slack had grown very still. "You're suggesting her blindness was feigned. But that would mean, Miss Marple continued, that she had access to information and opportunities that no one suspected, because everyone assumed she couldn't see. She could have observed Harold Finchley's habits in detail. She could have watched people's reactions and movements. She could have planted evidence and contaminated food without anyone thinking to question whether she was physically capable of such actions." The inspector was already reaching for his telephone. "We need to bring Sarah Whitmore in for questioning immediately, and we need to arrange for a medical examination by an ophthalmologist." The examination, conducted that same morning by a specialist summoned from the nearest city, revealed what Miss Marple had suspected. While Sarah Whitmore had indeed been born with severe visual impairment, A combination of medical advances and natural healing had gradually restored significant vision over the past 5 years. She was not fully sighted. Her vision remained impaired enough to qualify for legal blindness, but she had far more visual capability than anyone knew. Sarah Whitmore, confronted with this medical evidence, finally broke down and confessed to her deception. She sat in the interview room, her white cane abandoned on the floor beside her, and spoke in a voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "I discovered about 5 years ago that I could see shapes and forms," she began. "Then gradually I could see more. Colours, faces, details. It wasn't perfect vision, but it was so much more than I'd ever had. I could have revealed this improvement, could have told my father and celebrated this miracle. But I realized something terrible." She paused, gathering courage to continue. "I realized that my father's entire life had been organized around caring for me. His work, his finances, his social connections, everything centered on helping his blind daughter. If I suddenly wasn't blind anymore, or at least not as blind as everyone believed, what would happen to him? What would be his purpose?" Miss Marple spoke gently. "So you continued to pretend to be blind to protect your father's sense of purpose?" Sarah nodded miserably. "And because I knew that admitting I could see would raise questions about why I still needed a service dog. The truth was, I didn't need one as desperately as everyone believed. But my father had invested so much emotion in getting me that dog, in fighting Harold Finchley's delays and embezzlement. I couldn't bear to tell him it was all for nothing." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "Sarah, we need you to tell us everything about New Year's morning. Everything you saw, everything you did." Sarah took a deep breath. "I did hear 2 voices in our garage that morning, but it wasn't my father and Mrs. Price Ridley or Nurse Pell. It was my father and me. We were talking about the pancake breakfast, about whether to attend given everything that had happened with the Lions Club. I was trying to convince him to go, to not let Harold Finchley's actions drive us away from community events. But you told us your father was pouring liquids in the garage," the inspector pressed. "He was," Sarah confirmed, "but not poison. He was checking the antifreeze level in the farm truck, preparing for potentially icy roads after the breakfast. That's all it was, a routine maintenance check that I made sound sinister to protect him from suspicion." Miss Marple interjected. "But if you weren't blind, and if you were at the pancake breakfast, you could have observed everything that happened. You would have seen who had access to the food preparation areas, who behaved suspiciously, who had opportunity to contaminate the syrup and batter." Sarah's face reflected profound distress. "I saw many things that morning, Miss Marple. Too many things, and I've been carrying the weight of that knowledge, uncertain whether speaking would help or harm." "Then speak now," Inspector Slack commanded. "Tell us what you saw." Sarah closed her eyes, as if returning to that terrible morning. "I arrived with my father around 7 o'clock. While everyone assumed I couldn't see, I observed everything. I saw Thomas Whitmore at the syrup station, working conscientiously. I saw Nurse Pell arrive and go immediately to the kitchen. I saw Mrs. Price Ridley bustling about, giving orders and generally making herself important. And I saw something else, something I didn't understand at the time, but which has haunted me ever since." "Go on," Miss Marple encouraged. "I saw Dr. Haydock arrive early, before most others, carrying his medical bag. He went to the kitchen briefly, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes, then emerged and greeted people as though he'd just arrived. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Dr. Haydock often carries his medical bag, and it would be natural for him to place it in the kitchen where it would be accessible. But now, knowing what happened, I wonder." Inspector Slack's expression had transformed from satisfaction to shock. "Dr. Haydock, the village doctor. You're suggesting he contaminated the food?" Sarah shook her head uncertainly. "I'm not suggesting anything definitively. I'm only telling you what I saw. Doctor, Haydock had opportunity. He also had the medical knowledge necessary to plan such a poisoning, and he was the one who diagnosed Harold Finchley's condition, who identified the cause of death as likely poisoning. What if he knew, because he was the one who administered the poison?" Miss Marple felt the pieces finally clicking into place, the nagging doubt that had troubled her throughout the investigation finally resolved. Dr. Haydock had been present from the beginning, helpful and professional, providing medical expertise that had guided their investigation. But that same expertise would have allowed him to commit the perfect crime, using his authority and knowledge to direct attention away from himself. "Inspector," Miss Marple said urgently, "we need to examine Dr. Haydock's connection to Harold Finchley. There must be some motive we've overlooked, some reason why a respected village doctor would commit murder." The investigation into Dr. Haydock's background revealed what they had missed. 5 years earlier, the doctor's daughter had been engaged to a young man from a neighbouring village. The engagement had been broken suddenly and scandalously when it was discovered that the fiancé had embezzled funds from his employer. The young man had been prosecuted and imprisoned, and the doctor's daughter, unable to bear the shame, had taken her own life. The employer who had prosecuted that case so vigorously, ensuring maximum penalties and public humiliation, had been Harold Finchley. Dr. Haydock had never spoken of this tragedy, maintaining professional dignity despite his personal grief. But he had quietly left his previous practice and relocated to St. Mary Mead, where Harold Finchley had also eventually settled. The doctor had waited, building trust and reputation, until the perfect opportunity arose to exact his revenge. When confronted with this evidence, Dr. Haydock confessed with surprising calm. He had indeed contaminated both the syrup and the batter, using his medical knowledge to calculate lethal doses and his early arrival to access the food before others appeared. He had then positioned himself to be present when Harold Finchley died, ensuring he could control the narrative and direct the investigation. The appearance of planning a mass poisoning had been deliberate misdirection, exactly as Miss Marple had suspected. Dr. Haydock had never intended to harm anyone beyond his target. The contaminated batter in bowl 3 had been placed there specifically to be discovered during investigation, creating the impression of an indiscriminate attack rather than a targeted assassination. "I regret only that innocent people were drawn into suspicion," Dr. Haydock said as he was taken into custody. Thomas Whitmore, Mrs. Price Ridley, even Nurse Pell, they were all innocent of murder, though each had their own guilts to bear. I used their various connections to Harold Finchley to create a smokescreen that concealed my true motive. As the doctor was led away, Miss Marple turned to Sarah Whitmore, who sat quietly with tears streaming down her face. The young woman's secret was now exposed, her years of deception revealed, though she would face no criminal charges given her lack of actual involvement in the murder. "Sarah," Miss Marple said gently, "what will you do now?" Sarah lifted her face, her vision impaired but functional eyes meeting Miss Marple's gaze directly for the first time. "I'll tell my father the truth. All of it, about my vision improving, about my deception, about everything. He deserves honesty, even if it means losing the purpose he's built his life around." Miss Marple patted the young woman's hand. "You might find that your father's love for you transcends any single purpose. Parents adapt, Sarah. They find new ways to help, new roles to fill. Your honesty might be the greatest gift you could give him." Inspector Slack, organising the final paperwork of the case, looked at Miss Marple with newfound respect. "Miss Marple, your insight into human nature has proven invaluable. Without your persistence in questioning our assumptions, we might have arrested the wrong people and allowed the true killer to escape justice." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human nature is much the same everywhere, Inspector. We all carry secrets, we all make assumptions, and we all sometimes allow our prejudices to blind us to obvious truths. The key is to observe carefully, question constantly, and never assume that what appears obvious is necessarily true." As she walked home through the quiet village streets, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy that had unfolded over New Year's Day. So many people carrying burdens of grief, guilt, and deception. Harold Finchley with his embezzlement, Dr. Haydock with his long-nursed revenge, Sarah Whitmore with her protective deception, Mrs. Price Ridley with her reckless suggestions, Thomas Whitmore with his desperate love for his daughter, and Nurse Pell with her unresolved grief over her sister's death. Evil, Miss Marple thought, was rarely simple. It emerged from human weakness, from grief transformed into rage, from love twisted into possessiveness, from pride that could not bear humiliation. The New Year's Day pancake breakfast had revealed not just one person's crime, but the accumulated weight of an entire community's secrets and sorrows. St. Mary Mead would recover, as it always did. The Lions Club would install new leadership and restore the Seeing Eye Dog program under proper oversight. The village would continue its rhythms of market days and church services, of gossip and goodwill. But Miss Marple would remember this case as a reminder that even the most wholesome traditions could harbour the darkest secrets, and that justice required not just investigation, but understanding of the complex motives that drove human beings to acts both noble and terrible. The mystery of the poisoned pancakes was solved, but the human mystery of why good people sometimes did. Terrible things remained as inscrutable and troubling as ever. The end